I never thought a simple fence would lead me into one of the most intense battles of my life. Yet here I was, staring at the very people who claimed to protect the neighborhood, only to realize they had a very different agenda. At first, I thought it was just a small misunderstanding. But little did I know, this fight would turn into a storm that tested my patience, my courage, and even my faith in what's fair. You see, when you buy a home, you believe you own the land it sits on. You trust that the boundaries are clear, the papers are honest, and that nobody can just take what belongs to you. But the truth is, when a homeowners association gets involved, things can get messy, really messy. HOAs are supposed to care about the community. They claim to keep the streets clean, the houses neat, and the neighborhood safe. But what happens when the HOA itself becomes the problem? What happens when the very people meant to guard your rights try to strip them away? That was the nightmare I found myself in. It all started with a letter. A plain, folded piece of paper that landed in my mailbox one morning. I thought it was the usual, maybe a reminder about fees or a note about community rules. But as I read the first line, my heart skipped. The HOA was claiming that part of my fence was built on their land. Not just that, they were hinting at selling this so-called extra strip to someone else. I froze. My mind raced. How could they sell something that wasn't even theirs? At first, I laughed it off. Surely, this was a mistake. Maybe the paperwork was wrong. Maybe they confused my property line with someone else's. So I went to their office, calm and polite, ready to sort it out. But when I walked in, I didn't find helpful neighbors. I found walls of arrogance. They told me with straight faces that the land my fence stood on was community property, and that I had no right to it. My jaw tightened. My hands shook. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept staring at the documents I had from the day I bought the house. My fence line was clear. My deed was clear. I had every legal right. But here was the HOA, trying to rewrite reality. And worse, they were bold enough to threaten me with legal action if I didn't agree. Imagine paying for your home, paying your dues, following every rule, only to have your own neighborhood board stab you in the back. It felt like betrayal. Days turned into weeks, and the fight only got uglier. I started getting letters full of cold legal terms, warning me that my non-compliance would result in fines. Fines for a fence that wasn't even breaking the law. Each letter felt like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about principle. It was about dignity. I still remember the moment I looked at my family across the dinner table, their faces worried, their voices soft. My kids asked if we were going to lose our house. That broke me. That's when I realized this wasn't just a fight over wood and nails. This was about protecting my home, my family, and everything I had worked for. So, I decided to fight back. Not with anger, but with knowledge. I pulled every document, every map, every survey I had. I visited the county office, dug into public records, and even paid for an independent surveyor to walk the land. And guess what? Every piece of evidence screamed the same truth. The fence line was mine. The HOA had no claim. None. But here's the part that made me realize just how far they would go. Even after I showed them the documents, even after I proved my case, they refused to back down. Instead, they doubled down. They sent out newsletters to the neighborhood, painting me as the difficult homeowner. They whispered lies, making me look like the villain who didn't care about the community. Have you ever been lied about so loudly that the truth felt small? That's exactly what it felt like. I walked through my own street with eyes staring, neighbors murmuring, people I once waved at now avoiding me. The HOA wasn't just attacking my land, they were attacking my reputation. And the more they pushed, the more determined I became. One night, as I sat in my living room with stacks of papers spread out, I had a thought. If they wanted to play this game, I wasn't going to just defend myself. I was going to turn the tables. They tried to sell what wasn't theirs. Fine. But what if I bought what they thought they owned? That thought lit a fire in me. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about making a statement. And so, I started asking questions. Quietly, carefully. I learned that the HOA had debts. They were struggling with maintenance costs, behind on payments, and desperate for cash. That strip of land they claimed near my fence wasn't the only thing they were eyeing. They were considering selling parts of their borders to raise money. Borders that they believed gave them control. Borders that held their power. The irony hit me like thunder. They accused me of trespassing on their so-called land, yet they were willing to sell pieces of themselves just to survive. That's when I made my move. I approached them not as the angry homeowner they painted me to be, but as a buyer. With quiet confidence, I offered to purchase their border rights, legally, properly, with every document stamped and signed. At first, they laughed. Then they frowned. Then they realized I was serious. My offer was real. And their debts were real too. I won't lie, those negotiations were brutal. They pushed back, they sneered, they threatened. But I stayed calm. I stayed firm. I had something stronger than anger. I had truth, patience, and persistence. And slowly, brick by brick, their wall of arrogance began to crack. The day the papers were signed, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Not only had I proven them wrong about my fence, but I had also bought the very borders they used to control others. The same HOA that tried to take from me had now handed me their power. The irony was beautiful. The victory was sweet. But this wasn't just about winning a fight. It was about sending a message. To every neighbor who felt bullied, to every homeowner who felt cornered by unfair rules, I wanted them to see that you don't have to bow down to injustice. Sometimes, the best revenge is to rise higher, to turn the tables so completely that your enemy doesn't even know how to stand anymore. And as I looked at my fence, standing strong, untouched, I smiled. Because that fence wasn't just wood and nails anymore. It was a symbol. A symbol of standing up for what's right, no matter how loud the opposition screams. So, if you're listening to this story, remember this: don't let anyone scare you out of what's yours. Don't let papers filled with threats shake your faith in truth. Sometimes the fight will be long. Sometimes it will hurt. But in the end, courage always wins. This is only the beginning of what happened. The story doesn't end here. What came next was even more shocking, more dramatic, and more eye-opening. And trust me, you don't want to miss it. The victory of buying those HOA borders felt incredible, but little did I know, it was only the beginning. What I thought would be the end of the war was actually the spark of something even bigger. Because the moment the ink dried on those papers, the HOA realized they had made a mistake they couldn't take back. And instead of admitting defeat, they decided to fight even harder. I still remember the first neighborhood meeting after the deal went through. I walked into the room holding my head high, expecting silence or maybe awkward stares. Instead, I was met with whispers, gasps, and even a few angry shouts. Some neighbors clapped for me quietly under the table, but others looked at me like I was the enemy. The HOA board sat stiff, their faces red with embarrassment and rage. They couldn't believe one homeowner had outsmarted them. The president of the HOA, a man who always spoke as if he owned the entire world, leaned forward and slammed his fist on the table. "You think you've won," he spat. "This isn't over." His words cut the air like a knife, but deep inside, I only smiled. Because I knew something he didn't. I knew that legally, on paper, their power was shrinking by the day. And no matter how much noise they made, the truth was on my side. But the battle wasn't just in meetings or papers. It was in the streets. Some neighbors began to avoid me, thinking I had ruined the peace of the community. Others stopped to shake my hand, whispering their own stories of being bullied by the HOA. One woman, tears in her eyes, told me how they once fined her for planting flowers that weren't on the approved list. Another man confessed how he paid thousands in fines for parking his truck in his own driveway. Their pain fueled me. I realized I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore, I was fighting for all of us. And that's when the HOA made their biggest mistake yet. They tried to push me out of the neighborhood completely. They started flooding me with new violation notices, ridiculous ones. My grass was too long, even though it had been cut the day before. My porch light was too bright, even though it was the same bulb I'd always used. They even tried to say my kids' bicycles leaning against the fence were clutter. Each notice came with a fine, each fine with a threat. But here's the thing about fighting people who rely on fear. The moment you stop being afraid, their power disappears. I pinned every notice to a board in my garage, one by one, like trophies. Every time I looked at that board, I felt stronger. Because those papers weren't signs of my weakness, they were proof of how desperate the HOA had become. Still, I knew I needed more than courage. I needed allies. So, I started talking. Quietly at first, then louder. I invited neighbors over for coffee, listened to their frustrations, and shared my story. Slowly, word spread. People who had once been silent began to speak. They realized that if the HOA could come after me, they could come after anyone. And one by one, they joined me. Soon, we weren't just a handful of angry homeowners, we were a movement. We collected signatures, filed complaints, and even reached out to the local news. The day a reporter showed up with a camera in front of the HOA office was the day the board finally realized they were losing control. Their whispers turned to panic. Their threats turned to excuses. And their walls of power began to crumble. But here's the twist. Remember the borders I bought? Those pieces of land that gave the HOA their authority? With those in my hands, I discovered something shocking. The HOA's entire foundation of power was tied to those borders. Without them, many of their rules became unenforceable. Without them, their control weakened. I hadn't just defended my fence, I had unintentionally taken their crown. The realization hit me hard. I didn't just win my battle. I had changed the future of the entire neighborhood. The HOA had no choice but to renegotiate, to soften their rules, and to face the homeowners they once controlled like puppets. And that, my friend, is when the tables fully turned. The same president who once threatened me now sat across the table, forced to ask for cooperation. His voice wasn't filled with pride anymore, it was shaky, almost pleading. He knew that if he pushed too far, everything would collapse. The power he once flaunted was now fragile glass, ready to shatter with a single touch. For me, it wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. It was about making sure no one else would face what I had faced. So instead of crushing them completely, I chose something different. I proposed a new plan, a plan where the HOA worked with homeowners instead of against them. A plan where rules made sense, where fairness came first, and where respect was mutual. Some people were shocked. They expected me to burn the whole system down. But I knew destruction wasn't the answer. Real victory comes when you take something broken and rebuild it stronger. And that's exactly what we did. The road wasn't easy. The fights didn't stop overnight. There were still bitter words, still tense moments. But slowly, things began to change. The HOA realized they couldn't bully us anymore. The neighbors realized they had a voice. And I realized that sometimes the greatest battles we fight aren't just for ourselves, but for the people standing quietly beside us, waiting for someone to lead the way. Looking back now, I see the fence not as a line of wood, but as the line where I decided enough was enough. Where I chose courage over fear, truth over lies, and action over silence. That fence became the start of a revolution in our community. And maybe, just maybe, it can be the spark for you too. Because here's the truth. Life will always throw battles your way. Sometimes, it's a fence line. Sometimes, it's a boss, a system, or even your own doubts. But no matter what it is, you have a choice. You can bow your head and let fear control you, or you can stand tall and fight back with everything you have. So, if you've been pushed around, if you've been told you don't matter, if you've been cornered by rules that make no sense, let my story be your reminder. You're stronger than you think. You're braver than you believe. And sometimes, the very walls that trap you can become the doors that set you free. The HOA tried to take my fence. They tried to take my peace. But in the end, I took their borders, their power, and their fear, and I turned it into strength. And now, I turn to you. If you've ever felt trapped or silenced, share this story. Let others know they're not alone. Stand up, speak out, and never let anyone steal what belongs to you. Because when you fight for what's right, the victory is sweeter than anything you can imagine.